Why is it that a number of mergers and acquisitions don't work as well as expected?
It is true that somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of all acquisitions fail. So the success rate in acquisitions is obviously quite low. And the reason for that is due to a number of different factors. First off, inadequate planning. That is to say that the strategic plan behind the acquisition tends not to be grounded in too much of what the future strategy would be, but more of an opportunistic basis as to whether a company is able to be acquired or not. Secondly, the due diligence done on the target company tends to be done much too quickly, and in many cases doesn't focus on the key factors that are going to drive that particular deal to success in the future. More time should be spent trying to understand what it is that really makes that target company successful, if it is already successful, or why perhaps it has failed, and whether that can be turned around if in fact the company is being acquired because it is a company that's now available because of lack of success. And then lastly, there's really a lack of planning for the post-merger integration period. Many, many times a deal is done, and then once the company is acquired, the focus of management tends to disappear. They go on to the next deal. They go on to some other strategic initiative and forget that the really hard work comes, and the work that takes years and years comes after the deal is closed, when in fact the integration really takes place. The people have to start working together from two different companies now as one. The customer databases have to be put together. Back office systems need to be integrated. Suppliers need to be contacted, and basically two companies need to be made one.
And once the merger has taken place, what can be done to ensure the successful integration of the businesses?
In order to assure the successful integration of the businesses, one first must determine whether you want to integrate the companies completely and at what speed. That is, there are many deals where you actually want to make sure that the newly acquired company is kept separate for a period of time, perhaps to understand that company better, perhaps because you want that company to operate as a separate subsidiary. Other times you'll want to integrate the newly acquired company very, very rapidly in order to make sure that you don't lose customers, that you don't lose employees, perhaps because there's something that has a very time-critical element driving the purpose of the acquisition in the first place. Once you've determined whether you want to do it quickly or slowly, you also need to determine whether you want to impose your own culture and way of operations on that company, or in fact to keep that company's own culture separate, perhaps for a period of time, or again for a longer period of time. So determining the speed of the acquisition and determining how fully you want to integrate it are the two critical things driving then what you are going to do afterwards. Are you going to appoint somebody from the company itself to run that division, or do you want to bring in new management, perhaps from the acquirer's own management or perhaps from the outside?
Can you give us an example of an acquisition that has worked really well?
One example of an acquisition that has worked really well is actually the merger between Bank of New York and Mellon Bank, which took place back in 2007. Those two banks had actually, interestingly enough, 8 years earlier, had an unsuccessful attempt at coming together, where Bank of New York had made a hostile attempt to overtake Mellon Bank. However, in the second try, what they did is they understood some of the mistakes from previously. So experience is very important. But most importantly, what they did is they met very early, before the deal became public, and they determined what it was that were showstoppers, things that could derail, that could stop the deal in the future from being successful. And they did determine what those items were very, very early on. Each side put their cards on the table. They identified what those potential problems were very early and said, if we can't get past those problems now, if we can't agree on what those problems are, if we can't agree about how we're going to deal with them once we have merged, then we shouldn't go through with this merger. We want to make sure it's friendly. We want to make sure it's going to be successful. What they then did is, having worked through those showstoppers, those items that might not be successful, they then put together a team from both sides of very, very senior people, ultimately announcing the deal, including the identification of who was going to be running the firm, with about an equal number of people from both sides. Everybody therefore knew who their boss was going to be. They knew which businesses were going to be retained. They had some idea as to how the business was going to drive forward. And most importantly, they knew that very deeply engaged in the deal strategy as well as the integration process was the CEO and chairman of the company, who took a very, very public role in identifying what the company was going to be doing post-acquisition.